The smell hit her before the light did. Recycled air, institutional-grade cleaning solvent, and underneath both of those the faint copper and salt signature of a room where dozens of alien metabolisms had been breathing the same atmosphere for 4 hours. Commander Jess Tremaine had been teaching at the Kethon Unified Preparatory Scholem for 3 years, and she could still identify the shift in a room's chemistry the way a vintner could taste a bad cork. Something was off in Hall 17 today. Not chemically, atmospherically. The cadets were afraid. She stood at the podium, datapad flat on the surface, and let her eyes move across the lecture theater. 91 cadets, 12 species, tiered seating rising in a shallow arc, every seat occupied. The overhead panels cast their usual clean white light across the rows, picking out skin colors and textures in clinical detail. The chalk-pale Drethani with their membranous ear frills pressed flat against their skulls, the blue-gray Torvesi hunched low on their reinforced benches, the cluster of Palathi in the third row with gill crests sealed tight against the dry recycled air. And scattered among them, alone or in pairs, 7 humans. 7 humans in a room of 91. 3 years ago there had been 2. The year before that, 1. The Scholem's admissions board had doubled the Terran allocation each cycle, and each cycle the alien faculty had watched the numbers climb with the restrained discomfort of physicians monitoring a benign growth. Nobody objected. Nobody endorsed. They processed the paperwork and waited for the humans to wash out on their own. Tremaine knew this because she had been human number 1. She had arrived at the Kethon Scholem as a curriculum consultant, an exchange posting arranged between Earth's Combined Forces Academy and the Kethon Interspecies Defense Compact, which sounded prestigious and meant, in practice, that she sat in a borrowed office and read lesson plans nobody asked her to review. That lasted 4 months. Then the previous tactical theory instructor had suffered a resonance membrane rupture during a live demonstration, and the Scholem's commandant, a towering Sethurai named Lorik Don whose voice sounded like a landslide filtered through gravel, had walked into her office, set a course syllabus on her desk, and said, "You start tomorrow. Do not embarrass my institution." She had not embarrassed his institution. She had rebuilt the tactical theory curriculum from a lecture and exam model into a scenario-based integration framework. She had introduced cross-species squad exercises over the objections of 3 department heads. She had learned to read Palathi gill crests, Drethani ear frill positions, Torvesi somatic mapping postures, and 17 Sethurai jaw-click patterns, so she could grade participation across organisms whose feedback modes were invisible to anyone who had not invested the time to decode them. She had done this without an assistant, without a faculty mentor, and without the institutional support system that every other instructor, every alien instructor, every instructor who was not operating under the quiet handicap of being the only member of their species on staff, received as a matter of course. She had also not been thanked, endorsed, promoted, or invited to a single faculty meal in 3 years. She was tolerated the way a load-bearing wall is tolerated, structurally necessary, aesthetically regrettable. The faculty dining hall was on deck 4. Tremaine ate at her desk or in the empty lecture theater during off hours. This was not self-pity. It was resource management. The Scholem's social architecture was built on species proximity signals, pheromone signatures, subvocal communications, gill chemical exchanges that a human could not participate in without augmentation. She did not have and had not been offered. Eating alone was not isolation. It was an acknowledgement that some bridges were one way, and the energy required to cross them in the wrong direction was better spent on the cadets. Today was the final session of Module 11, Small Unit Tactical Integration Under Contested Conditions. The capstone. After today, her 91 cadets would either pass into Module 12 and their branch specializations, or they would not. Module 11 had not existed before Tremaine. The Scholem's original curriculum moved from Module 10, Advanced Species-Specific Tactical Doctrine, directly to Module 12, Branch Specialization and Field Deployment Preparation. The gap between a cadet's species-specific training and the multi-species reality of compact field operations was not a gap the institution had chosen to bridge. It was a gap the institution had chosen not to see. Tremaine had proposed Module 11 in her 7th month, in a faculty briefing that lasted 40 minutes and produced a silence that lasted 3 weeks. The proposal was eventually approved not on its merits, but because no one could articulate a reason to reject it that did not amount to "we have never done this," which was, in the SCOLAM's own doctrinal framework, not a valid objection. The pass rate for Module 11, across all species and all intakes since its creation, was 61%. In her 3 years, Tremaine had pushed it to 74. Each percentage point represented cadets who had learned, under her guidance, to stop treating cross-species coordination as an obstacle and start treating it as a capability. Commandant Don had never mentioned the improvement. She had not expected him to. "Last session," she said, her voice carried without effort. 3 years of projecting across alien auditory ranges had trained her diaphragm the way distance running trains the heart. "Module 11 capstone. You know the format. I pair you into tactical squads of 6. Each squad receives a scenario. You have 90 minutes to produce a joint operational brief and present it to the room. I grade on integration, not on species-specific tactical doctrine, not on individual brilliance, on how well 6 organisms that do not think alike produce a plan that works." She tapped the datapad. The holographic display behind her lit with squad assignments, names, species, seat positions. The assignments were not random. They never were. Tremaine spent more time on squad composition than on any other element of the capstone, because squad composition was the test. Anyone could produce a tactical brief with allies who thought the way they did. The capstone was about producing one with allies who did not. She watched the room absorb the assignments. Some cadets leaned forward, checking names. Others went still. In the 7th row, Squad 14 had already begun to fragment a trio of Drethani, pulling their chairs inward, while the squad's lone Pelathi sat frozen on the outside edge, gillcrests sealed so tight they looked painted on. In the 2nd row, Squad 2 was having the opposite problem. A Seth-Uri cadet had spread his datapad across 2 desks, claiming physical space the way his species claimed decision-making authority, and the 4 smaller cadets around him were already adjusting their posture into deference. Tremaine logged both observations without looking up. She had learned to write blind on the assessment slate the way a pianist learns to play without watching the keys. A Drethani in the 5th row, Cadet Sorvan, male, ear frills now pressed so flat they were nearly invisible, stared at the display and then slowly turned to look at the human sitting 2 seats to his left. The human, a young man named Ethan Coyle, met the look and gave a fractional nod. Sorvan's frills did not relax. Squad 7 was the one she had built most carefully. The squad assignments had taken her 4 hours the previous evening, working alone in the empty lecture theater, with the cadets' files spread across 6 datapads. She had run permutations not computationally, because she did not trust algorithms to capture the dynamics she was engineering, but manually, shuffling names and species like a card player arranging a hand. She had placed Coyle steady, quiet, physically unremarkable by Terran standards, the kind of student who never raised his hand and always had the answer when called, with Sorvan, the most academically gifted Drethani in the intake and also the most resistant to cross-species collaboration. She had added Pel Nashri, a Torvisi female whose species processed tactical information through a somatic mapping system that made their planning instinctive and nonverbal, effectively invisible to anyone who did not know what to watch for. She had added Dren Kas, a Pelathi whose gill crests made him the most emotionally transparent organism in the room. Every tactical judgment he made was broadcast in real time to anyone watching his gills. She had added Murin Voss, the second human, a woman in her late 20s whose file said logistics specialist, and whose actual skill set, which Tremaine had identified in week 2, was an almost preternatural ability to read group dynamics and reroute conflict before it ignited. And she had added Tosk, a Sethurai same species as the commandant whose primary contribution to every group exercise so far had been to issue orders and wait for compliance. 6 cadets, 4 species, every combination of friction she could engineer into a single squad. The capstone was not a test of tactical knowledge. It was a test of whether they could stop being 6 and start being 1. She set the timer, 90 minutes begin. The room had done this exercise 5 times before in smaller forms, paired drills, 4-person scenario labs. Each time the same pattern emerged. Species clustered. Drethani worked with Drethani. Torvesi worked on the floor. Pelathi worked near humidity vents. Humans worked with whoever was left. The clustering was not hostile. It was gravitational. Organisms fell toward the communication modes that required the least translation. And every time, Tremaine graded the output and saw the same flaw. Plans that were internally coherent and externally fragile. Plans that would work until the first species-specific assumption met a multi-species reality. She had built Module 11 to break that gravity. The capstone was the final test of whether it had worked. The room broke into motion. Chairs scraped. Datapads activated. Voices rose in the controlled murmur of 91 organisms beginning to negotiate. Tremaine stepped back from the podium and took a position at the rear of the hall, where she could see all 15 squads without being seen by most of them. She carried a secondary datapad, her assessment slate, where she logged observations in shorthand that only she could read. Squad 7 clustered in the 4th row, pulling chairs into an uneven circle. Tosk, predictably, took the center seat. The Sethurai was large, not as large as Commandant Don, but broad-shouldered and heavy-jawed, with the slow, deliberate movements of a species accustomed to being the largest organism in any room. He activated his datapad, read the scenario, and spoke first. Orbital defense of a relay station under simultaneous attack from 3 vectors. Primary constraint. Mixed species garrison, no standardized comm protocol. We divide by vector. I take vector 1 with the Pelathi. The humans take vector 2. The Torvesi and the Drethani take vector 3. Nobody spoke for 4 seconds. 4 seconds in a 90-minute window was a larger pause than it sounded. Sorvan's ear frills twitched. Not flat-pressed anymore, twitching, which in Drethani body language meant he was processing a response he had not yet decided to voice. Coyle was the one who broke the silence. His voice was level, uninflected, the verbal equivalent of a flat road. Tremaine had noticed this about him in Module 3. Coyle never raised his voice when he disagreed. He lowered it. The effect was that everyone leaned in to hear him, which meant they were already listening by the time the content arrived. That's a species-sorted plan. It is an efficient plan. Tosk did not look at Coyle when he said it. Sethurai addressed subordinates peripherally. Looking directly at someone during a disagreement was, in their social architecture, an elevation and acknowledgement that the disagreement mattered. It's efficient if each species is fighting its own war. The scenario says mixed garrison, no standardized comm protocol. If we sort by species, we replicate the problem. 3 groups that can't talk to each other. Tosk's jaw shifted, the Sethurai equivalent of a frown. You have a counter-proposal. Yeah, mix the vectors. Each team gets at least 2 species. Forces us to build the comm protocol in the brief instead of assuming one exists. Tosk looked at Coyle for a long moment. Then he looked at Mur and Voss, as though expecting the second human to back the first. Voss said nothing. She was watching the Torvesi Pel Nashrai, whose thick fingers were already moving across her datapad in a pattern that was not typing. It was somatic mapping. Nashrai was building the tactical picture with her body. the way her species always did, and Voss was the only other person in the squad who had noticed. "The human's approach has merit," Sorvan said. His voice was precise, clipped, each word placed like a component in a circuit. Tremin felt her assessment stylus pause. Sorvan had spent 11 modules resisting exactly this kind of concession. The Drethani's academic brilliance was matched by a species-typical preference for working within his own communication bandwidth. Drethani ear-frills processed information in layered harmonic patterns that no other species in the room could replicate. And Sorvan had spent the semester treating that as a reason to insulate himself rather than adapt. Species-sorted vectors assume intraspecies communication redundancy, he continued. But the scenario explicitly removes that assumption. We cannot plan around a capability we do not have. Tosk's broad hand flattened on the table, not a strike, a gesture of weight, of finality, the way a Sethurai ended a discussion they considered closed. "I have proposed the plan. We execute." Another silence. Tremin from the back of the hall logged, "TAHSK species hierarchical default. Expects compliance by presence. Squad has not pushed back yet." Then Nashrai spoke. Or rather, Nashrai stopped mapping and looked up, and her deep-set Torvisi eyes, small, dark, set in folds of dense gray-blue skin, found Coyle's face. She said one word, "Show." Coyle blinked. "Show what?" "Show the mix on the display, map it." It was an invitation, not a challenge. Nashrai's species did not argue in abstractions. They mapped. If you wanted a Torvisi to believe your idea, you showed it in spatial form. Coyle pulled up the scenario's tactical overlay on his datapad and projected it onto the squad's shared holographic workspace, a small, table-level hollow that all 6 could see. The relay station appeared in miniature, a 3-armed structure orbiting a dwarf star, each arm a defensive sector. 3 attack vectors, marked in red. The mixed garrison marked in blue with species designators. "Vector 1, Coyle said. Tosk and Kos. Sethurai command presence plus Pelathi early warning sensitivity. Kos's gill crests react to atmospheric changes faster than any electronic sensor. If the enemy uses chemical screens, Kos knows first." Dren Kos's gill crests flared at the mention of his name. Not agitation this time. Recognition. Somebody had read his capability file. "Vector 2, Coyle continued. Sorvan and Nashrai, Drethani targeting precision plus Torvesi somatic mapping. Sorvan processes fire control solutions faster than anyone in this room, and Nashrai can model enemy movement patterns in real time without a computer. You put them together, Vector 2 becomes a predictive kill zone." Sorvan's ear frills had risen. Slowly, incrementally, the way a sail catches wind. He was looking at the holographic map with the fixed intensity of someone who had just seen a familiar problem from an angle they had not considered. "Vector 3, Coyle said. Voss and me. We're the comm bridge. We float between vectors, relay information, and handle the protocol gap. Humans are generalists. We're not the best at anything in this room, but we can talk to everyone. That's what the scenario needs, not 3 good teams, but 1 team that talks." Tosk had not moved. His hand was still flat on the table. His jaw was still set. But his eyes, deep amber, slow tracking, had shifted from Coyle's face to the holographic map, and Tremin could see what the Sethurai was doing. He was running the plan, not agreeing with it, running it, testing its weight the way his species tested everything, by holding it and seeing if it held. "The Pelathi is not a sensor," Tosk said. "He is a cadet." "He's both," Coyle said. "Everybody in this room is both, that's the point." Tosk looked at Coyle, directly, not peripherally, not in the Sethurai subordinate address mode, directly, with both amber eyes focused and tracking, the way a Sethurai looked at someone whose position in the hierarchy had just shifted. It was a small movement, a rotation of the heavy skull, a refocusing of the wide-set eyes, but Tremin saw it, and she understood its significance in Sethurai social grammar. Tosk had just promoted Coil, internally, without speaking the promotion. He would not say it aloud. He did not need to. Every Sethurai in the room would have read the eye contact shift, and every Sethurai in the room now understood that the human cadet had moved from subordinate to peer. Tremin logged, COYLE integration argument landed, did not attack the hierarchy, offered function, TAHSK direct eye contact, elevation acknowledged. Cass's gill crests rippled a slow, complex wave that Tremin had learned over 3 years, mapped to something between gratitude and self-conscious pride. The Palathi had spent 11 modules being defined by his species' vulnerabilities, moisture dependence, fragile skeletal structure, slow sprint speed. Nobody had described his gills as an asset in a tactical brief before. Tosk removed his hand from the table. The Sethurai weight gesture reversed. The discussion was open again. "I will take Vector 1, Tosk said, with the Palathi." It was not agreement. It was something more nuanced. A Sethurai adjusting his position without conceding that his original position had been wrong. Tremin had seen Commandant Don do the same thing exactly once, in a faculty meeting, and she had learned more about Sethurai leadership psychology in that moment than in 2 years of reading their literature. The squad began to build. Tremin circled the hall. 15 squads, 90 minutes, and the patterns were already sorting themselves into the 3 categories she had identified in her first year of running this exercise. Category 1, Default Hierarchy. The strongest personality or the largest species took command and everyone else followed. Fast, clean, tactically predictable. These squads would produce competent briefs that collapsed the moment a single assumption failed. Squad 2 was already deep in this mode. The Sethurai cadet had finished dictating vector assignments and the 4 smaller cadets were executing without comment. Efficient. Brittle. Category 2, Democratic Paralysis. No clear leader, no clear process. Everyone contributed, nobody synthesized. Squad 14 had dissolved into 3 separate conversations within the first 10 minutes, the Drethani trio discussing among themselves, the Palathi reviewing the scenario alone, and the squad's 2 humans caught between them, unable to bridge the gap. Tremin logged. Squad 14, 3 parallel monologues. No integration layer. Category 3, the collision. 2 or more strong voices with incompatible frameworks, forced to reconcile or fail. This was where the learning lived. This was where integration either happened or it did not. Squad 7 was a Category 3. Tremin made a full circuit of the hall before returning to her observation post at the rear. On the way, she paused at Squad 9. A Torvesi female had dropped to the floor and begun somatic mapping, but her 4 squadmates, 2 Drethani, a Sethurai, and a human were standing over her with expressions that ranged from confusion to irritation. "What is she doing?" the Sethurai asked. The human cadet Odora, a Nigerian-born woman with close-cropped hair and a file full of logistics commendations, knelt beside the Torvesi. "She's mapping the problem. Her species thinks in spatial relationships. Let her work." "We have 90 minutes. We do not have time for alternative methodologies." Odora looked up at the Sethurai with the same flat expression Tremin had seen on human faces 1,000 times, the look of patience compressed into a single plane. "We have 90 minutes. We don't have time not to use her." Tremin did not intervene. She never intervened during the capstone unless a squad crossed into hostility. The exercise only worked if the cadets solved it themselves. Her job was to build the conditions and then stand back and watch the architecture hold or fail. She moved on, but she logged it. Squad 9 Cadet Odora bridging. Watch. At the 15-minute mark, she took a position at the rear of the hall and focused on Squad 7. Her attention kept pulling back to them. Not because they were the best Squad 3. A Drethani-heavy group with 2 natural leaders was producing the cleanest brief in the room. Not because they were the loudest. Squad 12 was arguing at a volume that would have drawn a noise complaint in most species legal systems. Because Squad 7 was doing the thing she had spent 3 years trying to teach, and they were doing it without knowing they were doing it. Nashrai had shifted from her chair to the floor. Torvasi worked better at ground level. Their somatic mapping was more accurate when their center of gravity was low. Nobody had asked her to move. Nobody had questioned it. Sorvan had angled his chair so his ear frills, now fully extended, could catch both Nashrai's subvocal hums and Coil's spoken English, processing 2 communication channels simultaneously. Kas had moved to the edge of the circle, not retreating but positioning himself where his gill crests could monitor the entire squad's emotional output, acting, without being asked, as the group's living barometer. And Voss, sitting between Tosk and Coil, had done something Tremaine recognized from her own playbook. She had made herself a bridge. Every time Tosk's jaw tightened, Voss redirected the conversation with a question that reframed the Sethurai's objection as a contribution. Every time Coil pushed too fast, Voss slowed the tempo with a logistical detail that gave the squad time to absorb. 20 minutes in, Squad 7 had a framework. Across the hall, other squads were hitting their first walls. Squad 14 had gone silent. The 3 separate conversations had not converged, and the Pelathi cadet was now sitting with his datapad off, gill crests pale, visibly disengaged. Tremaine marked the time. If the squad did not recover in the next 10 minutes, they would not have enough time to produce a presentable brief. She had seen this before. The failure mode was not hostility, it was drift. 3 groups that had never become one, slowly accepting that the capstone would pass without them. Squad 2 was on the opposite trajectory. The Sethurai's plan was nearly complete, delivered in crisp, top-down efficiency. But the 4 smaller cadets had contributed nothing except compliance, and the resulting brief, Tremaine could already tell, would reflect a single tactical perspective. It would score well on coherence. It would score poorly on integration. The Sethurai would be surprised by the grade, and the surprise would itself be a lesson. 30 minutes in, Squad 7 had a plan. 35 minutes in, something unexpected happened at Squad 9. The Torvasi had completed her spatial map, and Cadet Odora had translated it into verbal terms for the rest of the squad. The Sethurai who had objected to the methodology was now kneeling beside the floor map, running his thick finger along one of the Torvasi's projected vectors and asking questions. Not objecting. Asking. Tremaine logged. Squad 9 Sethurai kneeling. Threshold crossed. 40 minutes in, Squad 7 was stress-testing their plan, Sorvan running attack permutations, Nashrai mapping counter-movements on the floor with her hands, Tosk issuing logistical challenges that Kas and Coil answered in alternation. The squad's holographic workspace had grown dense with overlays, Sorvan's fire control arcs in red, Nashrai's movement predictions in blue, Kas's detection radii in green, Coil's comm links in white. 4 species tactical architectures, laid over each other, not conflicting but interleaving. 45 minutes in, Tremaine noticed Voss doing something subtle. The second human had begun annotating each squad member's contributions on the shared display with small markers, not labels, not credit tags, but functional icons that showed who had generated which element of the plan. The effect was quiet and powerful. Each member could see their own contribution embedded in the whole, could see that the plan was not a product of consensus, but a product of distinct capabilities, fitted together. It was the kind of thing Tremaine herself would have done. She felt a beat of recognition, the kind that bypasses pride and lands closer to relief. 50 minutes in, something broke. It started with a question from Tosk. What happens when Vector 2 loses Nashrai? Sorvan's ear frills snapped flat. Define loses. Casualty, incapacitation, atmospheric compromise. The Torvasi is no longer functional. What does Vector 2 do? It was a legitimate stress test question. It was also, Tremaine recognized, a Seth Uri loyalty test. Tosk was not asking about tactical contingency. He was asking whether the squad could function without one of its members, and by extension, whether any individual member was too important to lose. In Seth Uri military doctrine, no individual was irreplaceable. The unit survived by being interchangeable. The idea that one squad member's loss could collapse a vector was, to Tosk, a design flaw. Coyle saw it too. Tremming could tell by the slight shift in his posture a settling, the way a man plants his feet before wind. Then Sorvan runs Vector 2 alone until Voss or I can cross-link. Nashrai's mapping is an advantage, not a dependency. The plan works without it. It works better with it. And if the plan works without it, Tosk said, why include it? Silence. Koss's gill crests went pale, the Palathi equivalent of a wince. Nashrai's hands had stopped moving on the floor. Voss leaned forward. Because good enough isn't the assignment. Integration means using everything the squad has, not just the minimum viable plan. That is sentiment, Tosk said, not tactics. It's both. This was Coyle again, and his voice had not changed, still even, still flat. The register Tremming had taught him in Module 3 by example rather than instruction. The register that said, I am not arguing with you, I am telling you something true. Every capability you leave on the bench is a capability the enemy doesn't have to plan for. You want interchangeable. Build that into the brief. Cross-train the roles. But don't cut capability, because it doesn't fit a doctrine that was written for a single species force. Tosk stared at him. The amber eyes did not blink. Seth Uri eyes rarely did. Then Koss spoke. The Palathi's voice was thin, whistle-edged, easy to lose in a room full of deeper registers, but he spoke into the silence, and the silence held for him. He is right. I know because I am the one you would cut next. Nobody moved. I am moisture dependent. My skeletal structure is fragile. My sprint speed is the lowest in this squad. In a Seth Uri plan, I am the first liability, but in this plan, I am the sensor. My gill crests detected Sorvan's stress response 14 seconds before he verbalized it. In a combat scenario, 14 seconds is the difference between a warning and a casualty report. He paused. His gill crests rippled once fully, a wave that traveled from his jawline to the base of his skull. If you cut the Torvesi because she is not interchangeable, you cut me next. And then your 3-vector plan is a 2-species plan, and you have rebuilt the problem the scenario was designed to test. Tremming's hand stopped moving on her assessment slate. She had been teaching this class for 3 years. She had never heard a cadet articulate the core principle of Module 11 with that precision. Tosk was still for a long time. Seth Uri's stillness was not like human stillness. It was denser, more deliberate, the kind of motionlessness that large organisms adopt when they are restructuring an internal model. Tremming had watched Commandant Don do it during a curriculum review, the Seth Uri equivalent of a human staring at the ceiling, while their assumptions rearranged. I did not say cut, Tosk said. His voice was lower, not softer, lower. The resonance had changed. I said what happens when you lose. There is a difference. Coyle nodded. Then we plan for the loss. We don't plan around it. Tosk's jaw clicked. Once. A Seth Uri acknowledgement that did not carry the weight of agreement or the concession of error. It carried something closer to I see it now. The silence lasted long enough for Tremming to hear Squad 12, arguing 3 rows behind. Long enough for the environmental system to cycle once, pushing fresh air across the hall. Long enough for Koss's gill crests to complete one full slow wave, broadcasting the Palatha's words into the chemical layer of the room where organisms that processed airborne emotion, Drethani ear frills, Torvesi proprioceptors, even human olfactory systems tuned by years of cross-species exposure, could feel the weight of what had just been said. Sorvan broke the silence. He is correct, and the plan should reflect it. Nashrai pressed both palms flat against the floor, the Torvesi gesture of grounding, of anchoring a decision to physical reality. She looked at Tosk and waited. The Sethurai sat with the weight of a species that had commanded armies for 11,000 years. His species doctrine was carved into the syllabi of 47 military academies across the compact. His ancestors had codified the principles of force disposition that the Scholem still taught in Module 3. And a Palathi cadet, the smallest, most fragile organism in the squad, had just rewritten the doctrinal assumption that underpinned all of it. Tosk's jaw clicked, not the single click of acknowledgement, a double click and then a pause and then a third, 3 clicks. Tremaine had never heard 3. She did not know what it meant. She would look it up later and discover that it was archaic, rarely used outside Sethurai family ceremonies. The sound a patriarch made when a child taught him something he should have known. The squad rebuilt the plan. This time, Tosk did not issue instructions. He asked questions. Each question was structural probing designed to test load-bearing capacity. And each answer came from a different member of the squad in a different communication mode. Sorvan's precise verbal analysis, Nashrai's spatial demonstrations on the floor, Kass's Gilchrist feedback loops, Coyle's plain language summaries, Voss's logistical annotations. Tosk listened to all of it, and what he produced at the end was not his plan. It was theirs. At 65 minutes, Tremaine did another circuit. The hall's topology had shifted. Squad 14 had partially recovered. The Palathi had re-engaged, thanks to one of the humans physically moving her chair into the Drethani cluster and asking simply, "What do you need from us?" It was too late for a top-grade brief, but it was not too late for a passing one, and the act of recovery was itself a data point Tremaine would log. Squad 2's Sethurai had finished the plan 20 minutes ago and was now watching the other squads with an expression of patient superiority. His 4 squad members sat with datapads open and nothing to add. They would present well. They would score middling. The Sethurai would challenge the grade. Tremaine would explain, as she had explained 6 times before, that execution without integration was logistics, not tactics. Squad 9 had become the surprise of the session. Odera's bridging work had catalyzed something genuine. The Torvesi's floor mapping had been absorbed by the whole squad, and the Sethurai, who had initially resisted, was now the most engaged member, interrogating the spatial model with the intensity of a scholar encountering a discipline he had not known existed. Tremaine marked Squad 9 for a high integration score and felt the particular satisfaction of watching a pattern repeat. Humans as translators, not commanders. At 70 minutes, she returned to Squad 7. Their plan was complete. She could see it in their posture, the particular relaxation of organisms that have agreed on something. Not the lax ease of organisms that have given up, or the tense readiness of organisms about to present, but the settled, weight-bearing stillness of a structure that knows it can hold what is placed on it. 75 minutes. Tremaine called time for preparation of final briefs. The squads shifted from planning to presentation mode, organizing their holographic displays, rehearsing speaking roles, cleaning up their overlays. Squad 7 did something Tremaine had not seen before. They did not assign a single presenter. They assigned 6. Each member would present the component of the plan they had contributed. Tosk would open with force disposition. Kass would present the early warning architecture. Sorvan would cover fire control integration. Nashrai would demonstrate the movement prediction model, live, on the floor. Coyle would present the communications protocol, and Voss would close with the contingency matrix. 6 voices, 4 species, 1 brief. When Tremaine called the first squad to present, she worked through them in numerical order. Squad 1 delivered a competent brief, single-species leadership, adequate contingency planning, no integration to speak of. Squad 2 was what she had expected, crisp, efficient, and empty in the middle, like a building with a strong facade and no load-bearing walls. The Sethurai cadet presented alone. The 4 others sat behind him. Tremaine graded integration at 32% and moved on. Squad 3 was excellent. A Drethani-heavy group with two natural leaders who had, instead of competing, divided the problem by capability and reassembled it in a joint framework. Their brief was tight, well-reasoned, and delivered with the kind of polished confidence that came from a group of similar minds working in comfortable alignment. It would have been the best brief in most semesters. Squads 4 through 6 were middling. Good doctrine, minimal integration. The pattern Tremaine had seen in every intake, species gravitating toward species, producing plans that worked in theory and failed in practice. Squad 9 surprised the room. Odora stood and introduced the Torvisi's floor mapping system to the hall, and the Torvisi who had not spoken aloud during the entire 90 minutes demonstrated it live. The room watched a spatial tactical prediction materialize on the polished floor, and 14 cadets leaned forward. The Sethurai squad member who had started the exercise by objecting to the methodology stood last and said, "This is not how my species plans. It is better." The room's silence after that line carried a particular frequency, the frequency of organisms recalibrating. Tremaine graded Squad 9 at the second highest integration score of the session and felt the capstone's design working the way she had intended, not producing one correct answer, but producing 15 different demonstrations of what happened when different minds were forced to build together. The room applauded Squad 9 in the various species-specific ways that constituted applause. Drethani frill extensions, Torvisi palm taps, Pelathi gill flutters, human clapping, Sethurai jaw clicks. Squad 7 stood. Tosk walked to the front of the room, and for a moment Tremaine thought the Sethurai was going to deliver the entire brief himself. It would have been the expected move. Sethurai led. Others followed. That was the architecture of every Sethurai presentation she had witnessed in 3 years. Tosk activated the tactical overlay, looked at the room, and said, "This is not my plan. This is our plan. Each of us will present the part we built." Tremaine's hands went still on her assessment slate. In 3 years she had watched dozens of Sethurai cadets present capstone briefs. Every single one had presented solo. It was doctrinal. It was cultural. The leader speaks. The unit executes. What Tosk had just done standing in front of 90 cadets and publicly distributing command authority to 5 organisms, 2 of whom were human, one a Pelathi, one a Torvisi, was not just unusual. It was a violation of Sethurai pedagogical norms so fundamental that the 3 other Sethurai cadets in the hall had gone rigid in their seats. Tremaine could see their jaw muscles lock from across the room. The hall went quiet, not the productive quiet of attention, the uncomfortable quiet of surprise. Tosk delivered force disposition in 45 seconds, clean, efficient, Sethurai precise. Then he stepped aside and said, "Kas." The Pelathi walked to the front of the room. He was the smallest organism in the hall. His gill crests were cycling rapidly. Anxiety, Tremaine knew, not from Kas's file but from 3 years of reading Pelathi body language. But his voice, when he spoke, was steady. Early warning architecture. The standard model uses electronic sensor arrays with a 7-second detection to alert cycle. Our model supplements with organic biosensory capability. He paused. Mine. Pelathi gill crests detect atmospheric chemical shifts associated with weapons discharge, hull breach, and biological stress in adjacent organisms. Detection to alert cycle, under 2 seconds. This is not a replacement for electronic sensors. It is a parallel system that covers the gap between detection and electronic confirmation. The room was still. Kas's gill crests were still cycling, but his voice held. In simulation testing during Module 9, I detected Cadet Sorvan's stress response 14 seconds before his verbal report. In a garrison scenario with mixed species personnel, those seconds become force protection intervals. You do not need to understand how gill crests work. You need to know that when I say contact, you have 14 seconds more than you think. Stepped aside. The room processed what it had just heard. A Pelathi, the species that every intake year ranking placed at the bottom of physical capability indices, the species that most squad leaders assigned to logistics or excused from field exercises, had just stood in front of 90 cadets and described his biology not as a limitation but as a tactical asset. Tremin saw 3 Pelathi in the audience whose gill crests had gone from sealed to fully extended. Recognition, not of Kas, of themselves. Sorvan walked up next, ear frills fully extended, and delivered a fire control integration analysis that was so precise Tremin had to check it against her own solution key. It matched. In 2 places, it exceeded. Nashrai did not walk to the front. She walked to the center of the floor, knelt, and began to map. Her thick Torvesi fingers moved across the polished surface in patterns that, to species without somatic mapping literacy, looked like random gestures. But the holographic overlay tracked her movements and translated them into a 3-dimensional prediction model of enemy movement patterns, a real-time tactical map built by a body instead of a computer. 14 cadets in the room leaned forward. Tremin could see the moment it landed, the moment they realized that the Torvesi on the floor was not performing a demonstration. She was solving the scenario in real time, faster than any datapad in the room. Coyle presented the communications protocol. He did it in 3 minutes, using language stripped of jargon, and the protocol he described was elegant in its simplicity. Each vector would designate one cross-species communicator. That communicator would relay in the language or mode native to the receiving species. The protocol did not require every species to learn every other species' communication system. It required each vector to have one bridge. We built this because the scenario says no standardized comm protocol, Coyle said. Most squads solve that by inventing a protocol and assuming everyone could learn it in the field. We didn't. We built around what already exists. Every species in this room already has a way of communicating. We don't need a new language. We need translators. He stepped aside. Voss closed with the contingency matrix, a grid of capability loss scenarios, and the squad's planned response to each. What happens when Vector 2 loses Nashrai? What happens when Vector 1 loses Kas? What happens when all 3 vectors lose their communicator? For every scenario, the squad had a fallback that preserved the plan's architecture without depending on any single individual. This plan is designed to degrade gracefully, Voss said. Every capability is used. No capability is irreplaceable. The unit survives because it is built to lose a piece and keep moving. She sat down. The room was very still. The stillness lasted 3 full seconds. Then applause broke, not the polite, species-specific acknowledgments that had followed the other squads. This was something rawer. Drethani frill extensions held long, trembling at the tips. Torvesi palm taps hammered the desks. Pelathi gill crests fluttered in unison, creating a faint harmonic hum that Tremin could feel in her sternum. Sethurai jawclicks, 4 of them, from 4 different Sethurai cadets in the hall, sounded in near-simultaneous percussion. And the humans clapped. 7 humans, scattered across the tiers, clapping with the flat, steady rhythm of a species that had invented the standing ovation and knew when one was earned. Nobody stood. Nobody needed to. The room had said what it needed to say in 12 languages of body and sound, and the message was the same in all of them. That was not a brief. That was a proof of concept. Tremin stood at the back of the hall and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not pride. Pride was too simple, too personal. Something closer to recognition. The feeling of watching a machine reach operating temperature for the first time and hearing the hum settle into the frequency you had calibrated for. She had been teaching this course for 3 years. She had been teaching it in a room where she was the only human adult, where the faculty regarded her with institutional tolerance, and the commandant had never once acknowledged her methodology, where every semester she watched brilliant cadets sort themselves by species and produce plans that were technically excellent and operationally fragile. She had designed Module 11 to break that pattern. Squad composition, capstone exercises, integration grading, all of it was aimed at one principle that no one on the faculty had asked her to teach, and no one on the faculty had told her to stop teaching. A unit is not a collection of capabilities. It is a relationship between capabilities. And relationships require the one thing that single-species doctrine cannot produce: the willingness to be changed by someone who does not think like you. She had been the only human instructor in a room full of alien pedagogues, and she had taught this principle by living it. 3 years of adjusting her lecture cadence to Drethani auditory processing speeds. 3 years of putting her assessment materials on the floor so Torvesi cadets could access them somatically. 3 years of learning to read Palathi Gilcrests and Sethurai jawclicks, and the silent Torvesi floor maps that carried more tactical information than any verbal brief. She had not asked the Skalam to change for her. She had changed herself to meet the Skalam, and in doing so she had demonstrated, semester after semester, the principle she could not teach in words: that the bridge is built by the one willing to cross first. Squad 7 had just built the bridge. Commandant Don's voice came from the back of the hall. Tremaine had not heard him enter. The commandant was large, nearly 2.5 meters, broad as a doorframe, with the dense gray-green skin and deliberate movements of old Sethurai stock. He stood in the shadow of the rear door, his posture utterly still, and the room turned toward him the way a field of grass turns toward wind. "Commander Tremaine," he said, "a word." She walked to him. The hall watched. 91 cadets, and 3 years of quiet tension, compressed into a dozen steps across polished floor. Don looked down at her. His eyes were deep amber, the same shade as Tosk's, with the slow lateral tracking that meant a Sethurai was assessing something they had not expected to assess. "How many intakes have you run this capstone?" 6, 2 per year. "How many squads have presented a fully integrated cross-species brief with distributed presentation?" 1 today, Squad 7. The commandant's jaw clicked. Once, the same sound Tosk had made, the acknowledgement that carried neither agreement nor concession but something older. "I see it now. Your pass rate for Module 11 is 74%. "Yes, sir. The institutional average is 61. "I am aware. I have not previously commented on the discrepancy." "No, sir." Dawn was quiet. The hall was quiet. Tremaine stood with her hands at her sides, datapad flat against her thigh, and waited. She had been waiting for 3 years. Not for approval, not for thanks. For this, the moment when the institution she had tried to serve looked at what she had built and decided whether it was architecture or accident. "Commander Tremaine, effective next cycle, Module 11 will be expanded from a single-semester elective to a 2-semester core requirement. You will design the extended curriculum. You will select and train 2 additional instructors to deliver it across all intake cohorts. The instructors may be of any species." He paused. "Including human." Tremaine's face did not change. She had trained it not to. 3 years of standing in front of 90 alien cadets and projecting calm competence had given her a mask that was not a mask. It was simply the face of someone who had learned to hold steady while the ground shifted. "Understood, sir." "One additional matter." Don reached into the folds of his uniform tunic and produced a small object, a pin. It was the Skalam's faculty crest, a silver disc the size of a coin, embossed with the institution's 3-armed insignia. Every permanent faculty member wore one. In 3 years, Tremaine had never been offered one. Her title was still Curriculum Consultant, Exchange Posting. Don held it out. His large hand dwarfed the pin. "You are no longer on exchange. You are faculty." Tremaine took the pin. It was cool and light. Silver, with a faint blue tint from the alloy the Kethon system used for institutional metals. She looked at it for 2 seconds. Then she looked at Don. "Thank you, Commandant." Don's jaw clicked twice. 2 clicks was rare. In 3 years, she had heard it only once before when the previous commandant had retired and Don had assumed the post, and the outgoing officer had placed the command seal in Don's hand and received 2 clicks. It was not merely acknowledgement. It was respect from a Sethurai to an equal. He turned and walked out of the hall. The door closed behind him. The room held its breath. Tremin walked back to the podium. She set the pin on the surface beside her datapad. She looked at the room, 91 faces, 12 species, 7 of them human, and she let the silence hold for 1 more second. Not for drama, because some silences carry more weight than any lecture. "Squad 8, she said, "you're up." The room exhaled, chairs shifted, datapads activated. The next squad walked to the front and the capstone continued. But something had changed. Tremin could feel it in the air chemistry, a shift she had learned to read the way she read Gilcrests and ear frills and jaw clicks. The room was not afraid anymore. The copper and salt signature had thinned, replaced by something cleaner, something she did not have a scientific name for but recognized from the handful of moments in her career when a group of unrelated organisms stopped being a collection and became a unit. She picked up the pin and closed her hand around it. The metal warmed. Behind her, Squad 8 began their brief. In the 4th row, Coyle and Sorvan sat next to each other. Sorvan's ear frills were fully extended. Coyle was watching the presenters with his hands folded, the way he always did, quiet and steady and present. Between them, a gap of empty air that had been 2 seats wide at the start of the semester was now 1 chair. Nobody had moved the chairs. They had simply, over the course of 90 minutes, closed the distance. Nashrai sat on the floor beside her seat, legs crossed, fingers still against the polished surface. She was not mapping anymore. She was resting, her Torvisi body settled into the deep stillness that her species adopted after sustained effort, the somatic equivalent of a sigh. But her eyes were open, and they were watching Tremin. Kasa's Gilcrests moved in a slow, even rhythm. Not anxiety, not agitation. The steady, cycling wave that Tremin had identified in her 2nd year as the Palathi expression of contentment. It was rare in a classroom. It was rare in most rooms. The Palathi carried their feelings in their gills the way humans carried them in their faces. And contentment was a frequency most Palathi reserved for home. Tosk sat at the edge of the squad's cluster, his broad frame angled toward the presenters. His jaw was set but not tight, relaxed. A Sethurai at rest in a room that contained organisms he had, 90 minutes ago, instinctively sorted by species. He was not sorted anymore. He was seated at the edge of a circle that included a Palathi, 2 humans, a Drethani and a Torvisi, and his body language said, without words, without jaw clicks, without the ponderous Sethurai rhetoric of rank and weight, "This is where I sit now." Tremin graded the remaining briefs. Squads 8 through 13 produced variations on the familiar themes: competent doctrine, uneven integration, occasional flashes of cross-species insight that reminded her why she taught this course. Squad 14 had rallied enough to present a brief that was incomplete but honest, and the Palathi cadet who had been disengaged stood and delivered a 2-minute section on logistics that was, quietly, one of the strongest individual contributions of the day. Tremin graded the squad generously on recovery and marked the Palathi for a private commendation. Squad 15, the last, was a group of mostly Drethani who had produced a brief so thoroughly species insular that it could have been written by a single organism. Tremin graded it accordingly. They would not like the score, they would argue. She would explain. The explanation would be part of the lesson. She graded Squad 7 last, deliberately. She graded them fairly. She noted strengths and weaknesses with the same clinical precision she had brought to every assessment in 3 years. She did not grade them higher than they deserved. She graded them exactly what they deserved, which was the highest integrated score in 6 semesters of Module 11, and she logged it on her assessment slate with steady hands and a face that gave nothing away. At the end of the session, she stood at the podium and read the grades. She did this as she always did, by squad number, raw score, with a one-sentence note on each squad's strongest integration element. She did not single out Squad 7 for praise. She did not need to. The grades spoke, and the room, which had spent 90 minutes watching 15 squads demonstrate 15 different answers to the question of what happens when unlike minds are forced to build together, understood the grades the way an audience understands a final note, not because it was explained, but because it was heard. She dismissed the hall. The cadets filed out in the loose, relieved flow of organisms released from sustained effort. Some talked, some were quiet. The Drethani clustered as always, but the clusters were looser than they had been at the start of the semester, and here and there a non-Drethani walked among them without drawing the flat ear frills that had characterized cross-species proximity in Module 1. Squad 7 was the last to leave. They walked out together, not in formation, not in a deliberate display, but in the unself-conscious proximity of organisms that had spent 90 minutes building something and now carried the shape of it in their posture. Tosk walked with Kas. The Sethurai's long stride was adjusted, fractionally, to the Palatha's shorter pace. Neither of them appeared to notice the adjustment. That was the point. Coyle paused at the door. He turned and looked at Tremaine. He did not look at the pin. He looked at her face. "Commander." "Cadet." He nodded once and walked out. Tremaine stood alone in the empty hall. The overhead panels hummed. The holographic displays had auto-dimmed to standby, casting faint cyan reflections on the polished walls. The air was still warm from 91 metabolisms, still carrying the fading chemical signatures of 12 species, but the fierce scent was gone. In its place was something that smelled, if she pressed the metaphor, like clean metal and shared air. The scent of a room where something had been assembled. She picked up her datapad. She closed her assessment slate. She looked at the pin in her hand one more time, silver, small, warm now from the heat of her palm. She fastened it to her collar, where the institutional fabric met the line of her jaw and stood straight. The pin sat flush against the dark gray material. It did not shine. It did not need to. She gathered her things, turned off the podium light, and walked out of Hall 17. The corridor was empty. Her boots sounded on the polished floor the way they always did, steady and measured and human. Behind her, the door sealed, and the hall went dark, and the only light was the faint cyan glow of standby displays reflecting off walls that had held the sound of 6 voices building one plan. She walked toward the faculty corridor. Her boots made the same sound they always made, the flat, measured cadence of a human gait on polished alien flooring, a rhythm that had marked her passage through these corridors for 3 years without anyone commenting on its regularity or its persistence. Humans walked the same way they built. Steady, forward, one step at a time, without the burst and pause locomotion of Drethani, or the rolling ground contact of Torvisi, or the deliberate, weighted strides of Sethurai. Human gait was unremarkable in every measurable way, and it covered more ground per hour than any species in the compact's physiological database, because humans did not stop. They adjusted, they adapted, they kept walking. For 3 years she had turned right at the junction, toward the exchange consultant's offices, a row of small rooms at the end of a corridor that smelled of borrowed air and provisional standing. The nameplates on those doors were printed, not engraved. Temporary. The message was architectural. You are here, but you are not here permanently. Today she turned left. The permanent faculty wing was quieter, the doors closer together, the nameplates etched in the Skalem's institutional alloy. At the end of the corridor, a door was open. Inside, a desk, a chair, a window overlooking the station's central atrium, where cadets from a dozen species moved in the easy cross-currents of organisms who shared a space without thinking about it. The nameplate slot beside the door was empty. A small tool kit sat on the desk, the kind used to engrave institutional alloy. Tremaine stepped inside. She set her datapad on the desk. She sat down in the chair, which was calibrated for a body larger than hers, and adjusted itself with a faint mechanical hum until it fit. The adjustment took 4 seconds. 4 seconds of mechanical recalibration, gears shifting, pneumatics hissing, the chair reshaping itself around a frame it had not been designed for. She thought about that, the chair, designed for one species, adapting to another. A small thing. An institutional metaphor she would not write down but would carry with her. She looked out the window at the atrium. Below, she could see Squad 7. They had not dispersed to their species groups. They were standing near the atrium's central fountain, a structure that recycled condensate in patterns designed to be visible to species that processed fluid dynamics as an aesthetic, and they were talking. All 6 of them. Tosk's broad frame, Kasa's slight one, Sorvan's tall silhouette with its ear frills catching the atrium light, Nashrai's low stance, Coil's steady posture, Voss's angled lean. 6 cadets, 4 species, 1 unit. Tremin watched them for a long time. The atrium light caught Kasa's gill crests as they cycled slowly, and the light refracted through the translucent membranes and cast a faint green-blue flicker on the floor tiles around the Palatha's feet. It was a small detail. The kind of detail a human noticed because humans noticed light and color with a specificity that most species in the compact found excessive and occasionally unnerving. Tremin had spent 3 years noticing things about the organisms around her that they did not notice about themselves, and filing those observations, and building a curriculum around the simple, staggering principle that different was not deficient. She had not been sent here to teach that principle. She had been sent here to review lesson plans. The teaching had happened because she was human, and humans did not wait for permission to build. They saw a gap, they assessed the materials, and they started laying beams. It was not heroism, it was carpentry. The heroism, if it existed at all, was in the persistence. 3 years of building in a place that had not asked for the structure, and had not acknowledged it until today. The pin on her collar was warm, the chair fit, the nameplate slot was empty. She picked up the engraving tool, turned the nameplate plate over in her hands, and began to write her name.